We've been looking at the story of Jesus as it's told in Luke's gospel. It begins with the arrival of an unlikely king born in poor, humble circumstances.
Then we saw Jesus as a teacher and prophet. He went throughout Israel calling people to a radical way of life, where enemies become friends, the poor are cared for, where people find forgiveness for their failures.
He went from town to town inviting people to follow him and live under God's reign in this upside-down way.
And he did many signs and wonders, so many Israelites began to hope that he would rescue Israel from the Romans and set up a new kingdom of peace and justice. In short, that he would bring the kingdom of God.
Now, the religious leaders of the day were also hoping for God's kingdom, but to them, the message of Jesus was a threat.
Yeah, they had expected to gain power and prestige when this all went down. But Jesus said God's kingdom belongs to the poor, to the outsider, and that real power is serving others in love.
This conflict intensified when Jesus, while in Jerusalem, disrupted the temple sacrifices and called Israel's leaders a gang of rebels.
So they arrested Jesus, and they had him accused before the Roman authorities of being a rebel king. He was handed over for execution, even though he was innocent. Then he was taken outside the city and put to death on false charges.
This brings us to the final section of the Gospel of Luke. There was a religious leader named Joseph who opposed Jesus' execution and then requested to be given his body so he could bury Jesus in a nearby tomb.
And then a couple of days later, some women who had followed Jesus came to visit that tomb, and they found it open and empty, and they encountered these mysterious figures telling them Jesus was alive from the dead. So they run away terrified. Nobody believes their report. I mean, he can't be alive. They all saw him die.
Now, just outside of Jerusalem, a pair of Jesus' followers were leaving the city, traveling on a road to a town called Emmaus, and they were sad and confused about everything that had happened.
Then Jesus shows up, walking alongside them, but they don't know it's him.
Yeah, that's weird. Why couldn't they recognize him?
Yeah, it's an odd but really significant image for Luke. They're blind to Jesus for some reason, so Jesus asks them, "What are you guys talking about?"
And they begin to tell him about Jesus, a powerful prophet who they expected would rescue Israel, but was instead executed. Some women say he's alive, which is crazy. It's all too much. We're going home.
So Jesus tries to explain that this is what the Jewish scriptures had been pointing to all along, that Israel needed a king who would suffer and die as a rebel on behalf of those who actually are rebels. And then he would be vindicated by his resurrection so he could give true life to those who would receive it.
But it's still not making sense. They're as confused as ever.
Which leads to the scene where they sit down for a meal with Jesus. He takes the bread, he blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to them, just as he did at the Last Supper.
Yeah, this is the image of his broken body, his death on the cross.
And it's when they take in the broken bread, that's when their eyes are open to see Jesus. Then he disappears, and the episode's over.
So this is a story about how it's hard to see Jesus for who he really is.
Yes, this is brilliant. I mean, how could God's royal power and love be revealed through this man's shameful execution? How could a humble man become the king of the world through weakness and self-sacrifice? It's very hard to see. But this is the message of the Gospel of Luke. It takes a transformation of your imagination to see it and embrace Jesus' upside-down kingdom.
The Gospel of Luke ends with Jesus and all of his disciples together over another meal, and everyone's freaking out about his resurrected body. I mean, he's still a human, but way more.
Yes, he's passed through death and come out the other side, a walking, talking piece of new creation. And then Jesus tells them that he's going to give them the same divine power that sustained him, so they can go out and share the good news of God's kingdom with other people.
After this, Luke tells us that Jesus was taken up into heaven, which is a cool exit and all, but why disappear into the sky?
So in the Old Testament, the skies are the place of God's throne. They're above everything. So this is Luke's way of showing that Jesus has been enthroned as the divine king of the whole world.
His followers stay in Jerusalem, worshiping God and Jesus, waiting for this new power, and this is where the gospel ends.
Now, Luke is going to write about how they receive this power and take the news out into the world, and that's what his second volume, the book of Acts, is all about.
In March of 1973, it was becoming clear to Nixon's closest aides that someone had tried to cover up the Watergate break-in. There were no more than a dozen of us. Could we maintain a cover-up to save the president? Consider this, we were political zealots, we enjoyed enormous political power and prestige, and with all that at stake, you'd expect us to be capable of maintaining a lie to protect the president? But we couldn't. The first to crack was John Dean. First he told the president everything, and then just 2 weeks later, he went to the prosecutors and offered to testify against the president. His reason, as he candidly admits in his memoirs, was to save his own skin. And after that, everyone started scrambling to protect himself. What we know today as the Great Watergate cover-up lasted less than 3 weeks. Some of the most powerful politicians in the world, and we couldn't keep alive for more than 3 weeks? Let's go back to the question of the historicity of Christ's resurrection. Can anyone really believe that for 50 years the Jesus' disciples were willing to be ostracized, beaten, persecuted, and all but one of them suffer a martyr's death without ever renouncing their conviction that they had seen Jesus bodily resurrected? Does anyone really think the disciples could have maintained a lie at that time, all that time, under that kind of pressure? No. Somebody would have cracked, just as we did so easily in Watergate. Someone would have acted as John Dean did and turned state's evidence. There would have been some kind of smoking gun, a deathbed confession. So why didn't they crack? Because they had come face to face with the living God, and they couldn't deny what they had seen. The fact is that people will give their lives for what they believe to be true, but they will never give their lives for what they know is a lie. The Watergate cover-up proves that 12 most powerful men in America couldn't keep a lie, and that 12 powerless men 2,000 years ago couldn't have been telling anything but the truth.
Graphical test of any document, we're applying it to the New Testament. And the question is, how many manuscripts do you have? The more manuscripts you have, the easier it is to reconstruct the original. For example, if you have 20 manuscripts, and in those manuscripts you have the Gospel of John, but in John 3:16, there's 3 different renderings in those manuscripts. Some translate, "For God so loved the world," some say God thought a lot about the world, and some say God thought the world was cool. How do you know what's in the original? You can't. It's impossible. However, if you have 400 or 500 manuscripts, then it is so much easier to use those manuscripts to recreate the original to a high percentage of a pure text. Again, let me compare the number of manuscripts with other literature of antiquity. For example, Caesar and the Gallic Wars, there's only 10 manuscripts that survive. Of Plato, there's only 7 manuscripts. Many people consider the Roman historian Tacitus the number 1 Roman historian, and yet there's only 20 manuscripts that remain of his annals. Of Pliny the Younger, 7 manuscripts survive. Of Thucydides, 8 manuscripts. Suetonius, 8 manuscripts. Of the Greek historian Herodotus, there's only 8 manuscripts that survive. Everything else is lost. Sophocles, there's 193. Of Lucretius, there is 2. Of Euripides, 9 manuscripts. Of Demosthenes, there's about 200 manuscripts. Now, Aristophanes, there's only 10, maybe 12 at the most. And Aristotle, only 49 manuscripts. Do you know what there is of the New Testament? Just of the New Testament, I've been able to document 24,633 manuscripts of just the New Testament. I never knew that until I set out to write evidence that demands a verdict against it and found out that I was wrong. I was dumb. The only problem is others were dumber. They made a movie out of that, Dumb and Dumber. But in that whole process, I concluded there's absolutely no comparison in numbers between the New Testament and any other book in all of history.